Good day, everyone! Londononion here with our first Summoner Prime build, fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. As for our accompanying archetype, I choose to go with the Handler. And just for clarity, our doggo companion will be nicknamed Rufus for the duration of this discussion. So the Handler archetype is a class of versatility, utility, and contingency, with Rufus as the right-hand canine. A jack of all trades, but master of none. The Summoner is commensurately versatile, but with a greater edge toward offense and their summons as the main henchman. Taking a brief look at their perks, they aren't particularly synergistic, but still helpful to the overall efficacy of today's intended build. The prime perk of the Summoner, Ruthless, causes summons to become enraged upon dealing damage to them. This will increase their attack speed by 20%, movement speed by 50%, and damage by 50% for 40 seconds. As for their archetype traits, the Summoner naturally replenishes health over time at 1.5 health units per second. The Handler reduces both given and received friendly fire by 80%. There isn't an obvious relation, but these attributes will be integral to the success of today's pairing. Their practical use, however, is where their joint strength will come from, and this will transition us to the build. Starting off with the armor, for demonstration purposes, I choose the knotted cage armor set, but any heavy armor will do. Given how this build will be used, having efficient dodges will not be paramount, but having high armor is always welcome. As for the relic, this one is preferential, but I employ the Runed Heart for a boost in mod power and regenerated health. The shards I use are skill cooldown, armor effectiveness, and skill/mod cast speed. As for the weapons, our primary is a matter of preference. For this showcase, I use the Royal Hunting Bow with Space Crabs mod and the Supercharger Mutator for a 30% boost in charge speed and a 15% boost in critical chance when maximized. Plus, it is nice to have some long-range capability. The secondary weapon I employ is the Starshot Pistol. This weapon comes with its own mod, Big Bang, and I employ the Kill Switch Mutator, which creates an explosive burst upon switching to the weapon. When maximized, kills decrease the cooldown time by 1 second from 10. Lastly, the melee weapon is also preferential, but I would argue that the best option would be the Gas Giant, with maximized latency, which will buff the required activation for its special ability by 35%. With the basics out of the way, we'll move on to the amulet and rings. As many of you can guess, our leading amulet is the detonation trigger, which increases explosive damage by 25% and inflicts burning for 465 damage over 5 seconds. Our first ring is Blasting Cap Ring for a 10% boost to explosive damage. Next, Excess Coil grants a shield for 25% of one's max health for 15 seconds upon activating a skill. Following, I equip Generating Band, which grants 3% of one's max health per second while a shield is active. As for the last ring, there are a series of options, either Cataloger's Jewel, Stone of Malevolence, or Burden of the Rebel. Cataloger's Jewel and Stone of Malevolence have a similar end, but a different method. Cataloger's Jewel grants 8 units of mod power per second. Meanwhile, Stone of Malevolence grants 15% of elemental damage as additional mod power. Burden of the Rebel increases skill cooldown by 15%, while decreasing relic use speed by 25%. I personally favor Cataloger's Jewel, though the other two are still viable options in this Onion's opinion, but that is something we'll touch on near the end of our discussion. With the build ascertained, we'll move on to the skills, traits, and a brief discussion on the practical use of the build. So the skills are for the most part static for both archetypes. For the Summoner, I mainly employ the Hollows. The only time this may alter is during certain boss fights, where flyers would likely be more appropriate. For the Handler, I keep Rufus as the guard dog, though Attack Dog is also an option for increasing damage of one's summons. The main use of the Summoner Hollows is the Sacrifice ability, which causes them to explode. If enraged, their sacrifice inflicts more damage. With the current build, Base explosion damage will be in the 400 to 500 ranges, depending on distance, enraged status, and critical chance. Rufus's guard dog setting causes him to generate 15% increased threat when attacking, and has 20% damage reduction. Upon skill activation, Rufus will reduce damage by 15% to all allies and generate additional threat. The traits I employ are Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Amplitude, Bark Skin, Blood Bond, and Rugged. Alright, so to tie these two classes together and their intended use, the main meta is use of explosives, whether that be through Space Crabs, the Starshot mod, the Kill Switch Mutator, and of course the main source of explosions, the Summoner minions. For those familiar with Black Ops Killstreak Awards, they can essentially act as autonomous RCXD vehicles. With the current build, they have a cooldown time of 21 seconds with a mythic skill cooldown relic shard. As a small noteworthy detail, the more health they have upon sacrifice, the more the cooldown of the next summon is reduced. If pushing this strategy to its maximum efficiency, one can essentially use up 4 hollows in quick succession. If employing Burden of the Rebel, this number increases. Though under more practical circumstances, this will rarely be a requirement. Additionally, it is important to add that activating the Ruthless perk, Enrage, is a crucial step in this process to make more use of the sacrifice skill, and this plays into our weapon choices. When in the heat of battle, it's not always easy to summon a hollow and inflict damage seamlessly without jeopardizing one's well-being. There is a good chance one will have to be on the move. As an answer to this potential limitation, I use the Starshot to inflict damage on their target once they have closed in on them. Due to its explosive capability, the Starshot will inflict damage and enrage the minion at the same time. The major advantage to this is that the hollow will immediately stop wherever they have taken damage and stall briefly before attacking again, giving the summoner ample time to sacrifice the minion while they are enraged. One can enrage their minion prior to their target selection, however, due to their faster movement speed, optimal timing is a bit more difficult unless one is engaged in closer ranged combat. This will move us on to our selection of the Gas Giant melee weapon. The Gas Giant comes with its own mod, Dying Breath, and upon activation leaves an acid cloud for an allotted period of time. This weapon initially seems counterproductive, as one can inflict corroded on themselves and their allies if they walk into the acid cloud. But this can be instrumentally used as a shortcut to immediately enraging one's summons without having to use ranged weaponry. Corroded will last 30 seconds on the summoner and much longer if one is stationary in the cloud. The summoner's archetype trait, Regrowth, negates the inflicted damage, making the gas cloud effectively harmless. Also, with Rugged, summons will not take significant damage and still have sufficient health for optimal cooldown efficiency. Due to latency, activating this cloud may take 2 to 3 landed strikes on either enemies or environmental objects for proactive activation. Prior to foreseeable battle or in the middle of battle, one may perform a neutral evade charged melee attack and automatically enrage all summons that they spawn. Because of our ring selections, a byproduct of summoning and sacrificing minions would mean frequent skill activation, and consequently frequent health replenishment due to excess coil and generating band. Now some of you may have the critical question of how Rufus plays into this mixture. As the guard dog, he's mainly intended to play the role of a distraction, especially when in high enemy volume circumstances. His threat generation will take a greater number of foes away from the summoner, and activating his Howl skill will only increase his efficacy in doing so, while also being able to tank the damage he will likely sustain. This will not only grant the summoner time to spawn minions and time their sacrifice, but if using his Howl ability, he will inadvertently behave like the support dog and grant health due to shield activation. Now, even if one is out of summons for a brief period of time, the other explosive tools are meant to be an answer for this. The space crabs behave similarly to minions, but with less damage and a smaller radius. Additionally, you don't have to time their explosions. The Big Bang on the Star Shot is a controversial choice. Without the handler's kinship archetype trait, it is impractical without the proper space. Otherwise, the friendly fire / self-inflicted damage is negligible in comparison to what it can actually do. And finally, airborne targets may prove to throw off some of the explosive capability of this mixture, but both the Big Bang and the Kill Switch Mutator are effective answers to such profiles. Plus, with Amplitude, the Hollows can still inflict some damage, though they tend to become stuck when attempting to target airborne foes. This is partially why I also favor the Royal Hunting Bow. With the Sacrificial Hollows, Space Crabs, the self-destructive ruthless kill-switching beastmaster, and even the fearless yet loyal doggo companion Rufus, this onion would argue that this is truly a super squad. Now it is important to state that not all minions need to be sacrificed. They are there to do your bidding, and allowing them to stick around and watch your back is also a viable strategy. Explosives are best used for crowds or tough enemies. Summoning and sacrificing minions for a single Dran enemy, for example, would be a squander of one's skills, unless needing a quick boost in health. This is why I would prefer Cataloger's Jewel. Not all circumstances are fast-paced, and consequently, Stone of Malevolence would be less efficacious in such circumstances. Cataloger's Jewel will add to mod power accumulation continuously, regardless of the circumstances. If having a greater melee focus with Gas Giant, Stone of Malevolence would be given greater consideration. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die, even if that is almost built into the meta of a given pairing. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. Could I have added more explosive options? Perhaps, but then this onion would argue that they are too one-dimensional and vulnerable to easily exploitable weaknesses. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses, based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.